Admiral Kethavar stood on the bridge of his flagship as the largest military fleet in hegemony history emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system. 2,000 warships representing the combined might of 12 alien species united, under a single command. The fleet stretched across space like a metal constellation, each vessel carrying weapons capable of reducing planets to dust, and soldiers trained to crush any resistance they encountered. This was the force that had conquered hundreds of worlds and enslaved dozens of species, and now it had come to end humanity's defiance once and for all. All fleet elements report ready status, announced his tactical coordinator, a Vorthak officer whose species had perfected the art of breaking enemy morale through overwhelming displays of force. Planetary bombardment systems are charged and targeting solutions are locked on all major human population centers. Kethavar studied the tactical displays that showed his massive fleet arrayed against the scattered resistance forces that humanity had managed to assemble. The human fleet consisted of converted civilian vessels and captured alien ships, held together by determination rather than proper military engineering. By every measure of military analysis, the coming battle should be over within hours as superior hegemony firepower swept away the improvised resistance navy. Begin the final transmission to human resistance forces, Kethavar ordered. Offer them one last opportunity to surrender before we demonstrate the futility of continued resistance. General Patricia Stone received the hegemony surrender demand aboard her flagship, a converted mining vessel that served as the command ship for humanity's improvised navy. Around her, representatives from 7 different species worked together to coordinate the largest resistance operation in galactic history, proving that the alliance forged in desperation had become something stronger than any of them had dared to hope. The hegemony admiral offers standard surrender terms, reported Colonel Jack Murphy, reading from the alien transmission that had been broadcast to every resistance ship. Immediate cessation of hostilities in exchange for guaranteed survival of human populations under hegemony administration. Patricia looked around the bridge at the faces of humans and aliens who had chosen to fight together rather than surrender, separately. Chief Krothak stood beside Elena Rodriguez as they coordinated Altarian and human forces, while Dr. Kevin Brooks worked with a Caltharian scientist to analyze hegemony fleet movements. The sight of different species cooperating as equals was something the hegemony had never anticipated and could not understand. Transmit our response on all frequencies, Patricia ordered. Tell Admiral Kethavar that humanity and our allies reject his surrender terms, and that we choose freedom over survival, courage over safety, and resistance over submission. The battle began as hegemony forces advanced in perfect formation toward the smaller resistance fleet, but the aliens quickly discovered that their opponents did not intend to fight a conventional engagement. Instead of meeting the attack head-on, resistance ships scattered in all directions using tactics that exploited their superior knowledge of local space and their willingness to take risks that no professional military force would consider. Jake Morrison led a squadron of converted civilian ships in a desperate charge against the hegemony flagship, using mining equipment and improvised weapons to punch through alien defenses that had been designed to stop military vessels. His ships were outgunned and outnumbered, but they carried something that no hegemony tactical manual could account for: the absolute refusal to surrender that had defined human resistance from the beginning. All ships, remember what we're fighting for, Jake transmitted to his squadron as they approached the massive alien flagship. We're not just fighting for our own lives. We're fighting for the idea that freedom belongs to any species brave enough to claim it. Tony Williams coordinated resistance fleets across 12 star systems as the battle expanded from a single engagement into a galaxy-wide conflict. Using quantum communications, he synchronized attacks on hegemony installations and supply lines, while their main fleet was concentrated in the Sol system, proving that the resistance had learned to think strategically rather than just tactically. Confirming successful strikes on hegemony bases in the Rigel, Vega, and Altair systems, Tony reported from his command center in the asteroid belt. Enemy forces are being forced to choose between pressing their attack here and defending their strategic positions across their empire. Admiral Kethvar found himself fighting a type of warfare that violated every principle of military science he had learned during centuries of conquest. The Resistance fleet refused to be destroyed piecemeal, instead breaking apart and reforming in patterns that seemed chaotic, but somehow remained effective. Worse, reports were coming in of simultaneous attacks across hegemony space, as Resistance forces struck at targets that should have been safely behind the lines. Human resistance tactics are exhibiting unprecedented coordination without centralized command structure, reported his intelligence officer, confusion evident in his voice. They appear to be operating as a distributed network that becomes more effective when individual elements are destroyed, rather than less effective. The truth that the hegemony was beginning to understand was that humanity had never fought like other species, and their alien allies had learned to fight the same way. Instead of relying on hierarchical command structures that could be disrupted by superior firepower, the Resistance operated as a network of independent units that could adapt and respond faster than any centralized military force could counter. Dr. Lisa Chang coordinated the quantum communication network that connected Resistance forces across the galaxy, enabling the kind of real-time coordination that made their distributed tactics possible. Her invention had become the nervous system of the Resistance, allowing thousands of independent cells to function as a single organism while remaining impossible for the hegemony to destroy through conventional military action. All Resistance forces report coordinated strike operations proceeding on schedule, Lisa announced from her laboratory deep beneath the ruins of Denver. Hegemony forces are being forced to respond to attacks across their entire empire simultaneously. Sam Davis infiltrated hegemony command networks and began broadcasting the surrender demands that human resistance had transmitted back to the aliens, spreading the message of freedom to conquered species across hegemony space. The broadcasts carried more than military information. They carried proof that resistance was possible, and that the hegemony could be defeated by species that refused to surrender. Broadcasting on all hegemony frequencies, Sam reported from his hacking center, transmitting evidence of successful resistance operations to every occupied world in their empire, showing conquered species that the hegemony can be fought and beaten. The psychological impact of the resistance broadcasts was greater than any military victory, as species that had been suppressed for decades learned that other conquered peoples were fighting back successfully. Across hegemony space, underground resistance cells that had been dormant for years began to activate, inspired by the example of humans and their allies who had proven that freedom was worth fighting for regardless of the odds. Chief Krathak led Alterian forces in a coordinated strike against hegemony installations on his homeworld, proving to his people that their surrender 15 years ago had not been inevitable, but had been a choice, and that different choices were still possible. The success of the Alterian uprising inspired similar rebellions among other conquered species, turning the hegemony's empire into a battleground where every occupied world became a potential front in the war for freedom. Alterian resistance forces have successfully liberated the capital city, Krathak reported via quantum link. Hegemony garrison forces are retreating to orbital installations, and civilian populations are joining the resistance in numbers that exceed our most optimistic projections. As the battle in the Sol system continued to rage, the broader conflict across hegemony space began to take its toll on alien military resources. Admiral Kethvar found himself commanding a massive fleet that was designed to crush a single enemy, but was instead being forced to fight a war on hundreds of fronts simultaneously. The strategic situation was becoming untenable as hegemony forces were stretched beyond their ability to maintain control. Request immediate recall of all available fleet elements to suppress rebellions in the core systems, Kethvar transmitted to Hegemony High Command, his message carrying the admission that the human resistance had succeeded in its primary objective of inspiring galaxy-wide rebellion against hegemony rule. Elena Rodriguez coordinated the establishment of the First Galactic Freedom Council, bringing together representatives from human resistance and 6 different alien species that had joined the fight for liberation. The council represented something that had never existed before: a voluntary alliance of free peoples committed to mutual defense and cooperation rather than conquest and domination. The Galactic Freedom Council formally rejects all hegemony, claims to authority over free peoples, Elena announced in a transmission that reached every corner of the galaxy. Admiral Grace Turner stood in the ruins of the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C., staring at the charred remains of artifacts that had represented thousands of years of human history. The hegemony had begun targeting cultural sites across Earth and human colonies, believing that destroying humanity's connection to its past would finally break their spirit and force them to surrender. The alien strategy was based on psychological profiles of other species who had valued preservation over resistance, but the hegemony's analysts had fundamentally misunderstood what drove human behavior. They burned the Library of Alexandria, Recreation Center in New Cairo yesterday, reported Colonel Jack Murphy, Grace's intelligence officer who had been tracking hegemony cultural destruction campaigns across human space. Hit the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, the Aboriginal heritage sites in Australia, and 3 major universities in South America. Grace nodded as she walked through the museum's destroyed halls, past display cases that had once held the treasures of human civilization. The irony was not lost on her that the aliens thought destroying human culture would make humans more likely to surrender, when in reality, each destroyed monument and burned library only made the resistance more determined to preserve what remained by defeating their enemies. How are our people responding to the cultural attacks? Grace asked. Recruitment is up 30% across all resistance cells, Jack replied. Civilians who were sitting on the fence are joining active operations, and our fighters are showing increased determination in combat situations. 300 kilometers beneath the surface of Mars, Dr. Kevin Brooks worked in the abandoned research facility that had become humanity's center for xenobiological studies. Before the invasion, Kevin had studied alien life forms with scientific curiosity. But now he studied the hegemony species with the focused intensity of someone whose survival depended on understanding his enemies. His research had revealed weaknesses in alien psychology that could be exploited by human resistance tactics. The hegemony member species all follow hierarchical command structures with clearly defined authority chains, Kevin explained to the group of resistance leaders who had gathered via quantum link to hear his briefing. They expect their enemies to behave the same way, which is why they keep targeting command centers and leadership positions that don't actually exist in our resistance network. Sam Davis, the 17-year-old computer genius who had been homeschooled on a farming colony before becoming one of humanity's top codebreakers, listened to Kevin's analysis while simultaneously working on cracking the latest hegemony encryption protocols. Sam had discovered that alien computer systems were incredibly sophisticated, but followed logical patterns that made them vulnerable to the kind of chaotic problem-solving that human minds excelled at. I've broken into their tactical communication network again, Sam announced, fingers flying across a keyboard built from scavenged alien components and human electronics. They're planning a major offensive against the Australian resistance cells next week, but they're also pulling forces away from the European sectors to support the operation. Grace smiled as she absorbed this information, already seeing the opportunity that hegemony military doctrine had created. Coordinate with cell leaders in Australia to prepare defensive positions, then organize simultaneous attacks on hegemony supply lines in Europe while their forces are deployed elsewhere, she ordered. Show them what happens when you concentrate. Your forces against humans who refuse to stay concentrated themselves. The hegemony's psychological warfare campaign had backfired in ways that Admiral Kethvar was only beginning to understand. Instead of breaking human morale, the destruction of cultural sites had created a new motivation for resistance that transcended simple survival instincts. Humans were no longer just fighting to stay alive, they were fighting to preserve their identity as a species, and that made them far more dangerous than any military analysis had predicted. Human resistance activity has increased by 47% since the implementation of cultural targeting protocols, reported Kethvar's psychological warfare specialist, a member of the Nethys species whose entire civilization had surrendered after losing 3 major cities. Their communications intercepts indicate that humans view our cultural destruction campaign as an attack on their fundamental identity rather than a demonstration of our superior power. Kethvar studied the tactical displays that showed increasing human resistance across every occupied system under his command. The aliens had control of major population centers and strategic resources, but the humans continued to operate with impunity in the spaces between those controlled areas. Worse, human attacks were becoming more sophisticated and better coordinated, suggesting that their primitive command structure was somehow evolving in response to hegemony pressure. Deploy the pacification specialists from the Vorthak Empire, Kethvar decided. Begin systematic interrogation of captured humans to identify resistance leadership and communication methods. But the Vorthak specialists discovered something that confused them even more than human resistance tactics. The humans they captured refused to provide useful information even under torture, but not because they were protecting specific leaders or locations. Instead, they seemed genuinely unable to provide information about overall resistance strategy because no such centralized strategy existed. Each human cell operated independently, while somehow still coordinating with other cells through methods that Vorthak interrogation techniques could not identify. Elena Rodriguez crouched in the ruins of Barcelona's cathedral, using the building's stone walls to shield her makeshift laboratory from hegemony sensor sweeps. As humanity's leading expert in xenolinguistics, Elena had been working to decode captured hegemony communications and understand the political structure of the alien alliance. Her research had revealed something that gave her hope. The hegemony was not as unified as it appeared to be. I've identified 17 different languages in their internal communications, Elena reported during a quantum-linked strategy meeting with resistance leaders across the galaxy. More importantly, I've detected criticism of current military strategy from member species who are questioning the cost of occupying human territory. The information Elena had discovered opened new possibilities for human resistance strategy. If the hegemony alliance was beginning to show cracks, then humanity's continued resistance might do more than just survive. It might actually destabilize the entire alien power structure. But exploiting those weaknesses would require coordination, on a scale that no human military force had ever attempted. Tony Williams worked in the hidden engineering facility beneath Detroit's ruins, reverse engineering alien technology that his teams had captured during raids on hegemony installations. Tony had been designing civilian spacecraft before the invasion, but now he applied his knowledge to creating hybrid weapons that combined human ingenuity with alien technology. His latest creation was a stealth system that made human ships invisible to hegemony sensors by mimicking natural space phenomena. The new cloaking devices are ready for field testing, Tony announced during a resistance leadership meeting. We can equip 50 ships with technology that will let them operate in hegemony-controlled space without detection. Grace Turner coordinated the largest operation in human resistance history, using quantum communications to synchronize attacks across 12 star systems simultaneously. The plan required precise timing and unprecedented cooperation between resistance cells that had been operating independently for months. But the quantum network made such coordination possible for the first time since the invasion began. All cells report ready status, announced Zara Hassan, who had become the primary coordinator for quantum communications across human space. We have confirmation from mining stations, agricultural colonies, and underground cells on 18 different worlds. The coordinated attack began at exactly the same moment across light years of space, as human resistance cells struck at hegemony supply lines, communication installations, and isolated outposts. The aliens had spread their forces thin to maintain control over human territory, and the simultaneous attacks exposed the weakness of that strategy. Hegemony forces found themselves under attack everywhere at once by enemies who seemed to know exactly where alien forces were weakest. At Mining Station Omega-7, Ryan Bell led his converted industrial facility in an assault on a hegemony supply convoy, using mining equipment to cripple alien ships before they could call for reinforcements. On New Montana, Maya Patel's agricultural resistance used their knowledge of local terrain to trap an entire hegemony battalion in a canyon where alien air support could not operate effectively. Across human space, similar scenes played out as resistance cells demonstrated that humans could coordinate complex operations without the hierarchical command structure that alien military doctrine assumed was necessary. The success of the coordinated attacks sent shockwaves through hegemony command structure as Admiral Kethvar realized that he was no longer fighting isolated resistance cells, but a unified species-wide military force that operated according to principles his strategic training had never prepared him to counter. Chief Krathak of the Alterian people stood in the shadows of his homeworld's capital city, watching hegemony patrol ships move overhead like mechanical vultures. His species had surrendered to the aliens 15 years ago after losing their fleet in a brief and hopeless war, accepting occupation in exchange for the survival of their population. But news of human resistance had awakened something in Krathak that he thought had died when his people chose survival over freedom. The humans continued to fight despite losing most of their worlds, reported his aide, a young Alterian named Velnash, who had been too young to remember freedom before the hegemony arrived. Intelligence reports indicate that their resistance is actually growing stronger and spreading to other systems. Krathak turned away from the window, his scaled face showing the first expression of hope that any Alterian had dared to display since the surrender. His people had accepted hegemony rule because they believed resistance was impossible, but the humans were proving that calculation wrong. If one species could continue fighting against such overwhelming odds, perhaps other species could remember what they had lost when they surrendered. Contact the underground cells that still exist among our people, Krathak ordered quietly. Tell them that the humans have shown us that surrender is not the only choice, and perhaps it is time for Alterians to remember what freedom means. Elena Rodriguez transmitted the first interspecies communication in galactic history from her hidden base in the mountains of Spain, using quantum encryption to reach across space to Krathak's homeworld. The message was simple but carried implications that could reshape the balance of power across the galaxy. Humanity was willing to share its resistance technology and tactics with any species brave enough to fight for freedom. This is Elena Rodriguez speaking for the Human Resistance Network. She transmitted across dimensions that hegemony sensors could not monitor. We offer alliance to any species willing to stand against hegemony oppression. We offer technology to any people ready to fight for their freedom. And we offer proof that resistance is possible even against impossible odds. The quantum message reached 17 different star systems where conquered species had maintained hidden resistance cells, sparking conversations that had been forbidden for decades. Species that had surrendered to preserve their populations began to wonder if preservation without freedom was really preservation at all, and whether the example of human determination might offer a different path forward. Tony Williams supervised the construction of the first interspecies resistance ship in an asteroid belt mining facility that had been abandoned since the early days of the war. The vessel combined human engineering with Alterian metallurgy and quantum communication technology, creating a craft that could operate undetected in hegemony space while coordinating resistance activities across multiple species. The ship represented something that the hegemony had never anticipated: cooperation between conquered species that transcended the isolation the aliens imposed to maintain control. Drive systems are online and stealth generators are functioning within acceptable parameters, reported his chief engineer, a woman named Lisa Martinez, who had been building civilian shuttles before the war turned her into a military contractor. The Alterian armor plating is 30% more effective than our previous designs, and their shield technology integrates perfectly with our weapon systems. Admiral Grace Turner coordinated the first joint operation between human and Alterian resistance forces, using quantum communications to synchronize attacks on hegemony installations in both star systems simultaneously. The operation required trusting an alien species for the first time since the war began, but Grace understood that humanity could not win the war alone. They needed allies who were equally committed to freedom. Alterian strike teams report ready. Status, announced Zara Hassan from her communications center in the Denver Underground. Chief Krathak confirms that his people are prepared to move against the hegemony garrison on their homeworld at the same time our forces hit the supply depot in the Sol system. The joint attack succeeded beyond the hopes of either species, as human and Alterian resistance fighters proved that cooperation between different peoples could multiply their effectiveness against hegemony forces. More importantly, the success of the operation inspired other conquered species to contact the growing alliance and ask how they could join the fight for freedom. Dr. Kevin Brooks analyzed the psychological impact of multi-species resistance on hegemony morale through intercepted communications and behavioral observation of alien forces. His research revealed that the aliens had based their entire military doctrine on the assumption that conquered species would remain isolated and unable to coordinate effective resistance. The emergence of interspecies cooperation was forcing the hegemony to confront the possibility that their empire might face coordinated rebellion on multiple fronts. Hegemony communications show increasing concern about resistance spreading to member species within their own alliance. Kevin reported during a strategy meeting that now included representatives from 4 different alien species. Some of their client states are beginning to question whether continued cooperation with the hegemony serves their best interests. Sam Davis discovered the location of a major hegemony fleet concentration by hacking into their strategic planning network, revealing that the aliens were preparing for a massive offensive designed to crush human resistance once and for all. The intelligence provided advance warning that allowed the resistance to prepare for the largest battle of the war, but it also revealed the true scope of hegemony military power when fully committed to a single objective. They're assembling forces from 8 different fleets, Sam announced from his computer center in the ruins of Chicago. Over 2,000 ships with enough firepower to sterilize entire planets, commanded by Admiral Kethvar himself and scheduled to begin operations against human space in 6 weeks. The news of the coming offensive forced the resistance to make a decision that would determine the future of the war: retreat to hidden bases and survive the attack, or gather their own forces for a battle that could either win the war or end. Human resistance forever. Grace Turner called for a vote among all resistance leaders, human and alien alike, to decide whether they would face the hegemony fleet in open battle. "We have 2 choices," Grace announced to the assembled representatives of 5 different species who had joined the resistance. "We can hide and hope to survive the offensive, or we can meet their fleet with everything we have and prove that free people fight harder than slaves." The vote was unanimous across all species. They would stand and fight rather than hide and hope. The decision represented a fundamental shift in resistance strategy from survival to victory, from hoping to endure hegemony occupation to actively working to destroy hegemony power. But winning such a battle would require coordination and sacrifice on a scale that had never been attempted in galactic history. Elena Rodriguez established communication links with underground resistance cells in over 30 star systems, creating a network of cooperation that spanned multiple species and thousands of light years. The quantum communication technology that Dr. Chang had developed allowed instantaneous coordination between scattered resistance forces, making it possible for different species to work together despite being separated by vast distances. "We now have confirmed resistance activity among the Caltharians, the Zephyrians, the Nethys, and even some members of the Vorthak Empire," Elena reported during a galaxy-wide resistance meeting. "The hegemony is facing rebellion not just from conquered species but from within their own alliance structure." Nick Carter commanded a fleet of converted civilian vessels that served as the resistance navy, ships that had been designed for mining and farming and transportation, but now carried weapons and soldiers from multiple species united in their determination to fight for freedom. The fleet was a perfect representation of the resistance itself, improvised, diverse, and held together by determination rather than superior technology. "All ships report ready for combat operations," Nick announced from the bridge of his flagship, a former agricultural transport that now bristled with weapon systems designed by human engineers and Alterian scientists working together. "We have confirmation from resistance fleets in 12 other systems that they are prepared to coordinate their attacks with our operations." The resistance had grown from isolated human survival efforts into a galaxy-wide alliance of free peoples, but their greatest test was still ahead. Admiral Kethvar's massive fleet represented the full military might of the hegemony, focused on a single objective: the complete destruction of human resistance and the elimination of the idea that freedom was possible for conquered species. The coming battle would determine whether the spark of resistance that humanity had kindled would grow into a fire that could burn away the hegemony's empire, or whether it would be extinguished forever by superior alien firepower. As resistance, forces across the galaxy prepared for the largest battle in their history. They carried with them the knowledge that they were fighting not just for their own survival, but for the future of freedom itself. Captain Ryan Bell gripped the manual controls of mining station Omega-7 as another hegemony patrol ship approached their position in the Kepler system. The station had been built to extract rare minerals from asteroid fields, but now it served as humanity's fortress in a star system where no human was supposed to exist anymore. Ryan had converted the mining lasers into weapons and turned the ore processing facilities into ammunition factories, proving that human engineers could make tools of war from anything. Incoming transmission from the patrol ship, reported his communications officer, a woman named Carol Barnes who had been the station's accountant before the war. They're demanding we surrender and prepare for inspection. Ryan smiled as he powered up the mining laser array, massive industrial beams designed to cut through solid rock and metal. Tell them we're experiencing technical difficulties with our communication system, he said. Then show them what happens when you threaten a human mining operation. The hegemony patrol ship approached confidently, its crew expecting another easy capture of an isolated human outpost. They had taken dozens of similar facilities across the galaxy, usually without firing a shot, as the terrified humans realized. Resistance was hopeless. But as the alien ship moved within range, Omega-7's mining lasers opened fire with the concentrated fury of industrial equipment turned toward war. 3,000 light-years away on the agricultural world of New Montana, Maya Patel watched hegemony troop transports land in the valley below her hiding place in the mountain forests. The colony had been built to feed the expanding human presence in this sector, vast farms and ranches that could produce enough food for a dozen worlds. Now the aliens wanted those resources for themselves, and they expected the human colonists to work as slaves to feed hegemony forces. Maya had been the colony's agricultural coordinator before the invasion, responsible for crop rotation and harvest schedules across 50,000 square kilometers of farmland. Now she used that same knowledge to plan ambushes and coordinate resistance activities across terrain that she knew better than any alien scanner could map. Her fighters moved through irrigation tunnels and grain storage facilities, striking at hegemony forces and disappearing back into the landscape they had helped create. The aliens are setting up a command post near the main irrigation hub, reported Danny Torres, one of her scouts who had been a farm equipment mechanic before becoming a guerrilla fighter. They think controlling the water supply will force us to surrender. Maya studied the map of the colony's water system, tracing lines that represented years of careful engineering and planning. Then we'll show them that humans don't surrender when you threaten their resources, she said. We take those resources away from everyone until the aliens realize they're not worth occupying. Between the resistance cells scattered across human space, Nick Carter piloted his modified freighter through asteroid fields and nebula clouds, carrying supplies and messages to isolated human communities that refused to surrender. His ship looked like space junk to alien sensors, a collection of mismatched parts and outdated equipment that no serious military force would consider a threat. Nick had built that appearance carefully, turning his vessel into the perfect smuggler's tool for a war where being invisible was more important than being fast. Approaching the Ross system, announced his co-pilot, a former merchant marine named Steve Garcia, who had joined Nick's operation after his own ship was destroyed in the early days of the war. Hegemony patrols are heavy in this area, but I've got a course plotted through the outer comet field that should keep us clear of their sensors. Nick nodded as he adjusted their approach vector, threading the ship between chunks of ice and rock that had been drifting in space since the system formed. Hidden among the comets was a human mining colony that had been cut off from all outside contact when the hegemony arrived. A small community that should have surrendered months ago but instead had chosen to keep fighting with whatever resources they could find. On Earth, Dr. Lisa Chang's breakthrough came at 3 a.m. as she worked alone in her underground laboratory. The quantum entanglement field she had been developing suddenly stabilized, creating a connection that transcended normal space and time. For the first time since the invasion began, She had a way to communicate instantly across any distance, without using technology that the hegemony could detect or intercept. Testing quantum link to resistance cell 77 alpha, she whispered into her jury-rigged transmitter, hoping that her calculations were correct and that someone on the other side of the planet would hear her voice. The response came back, immediately, clear and strong despite traveling through dimensions that alien science barely understood. "This is cell 77 alpha. We read you perfectly. How is this possible?" Lisa began to cry as she realized what her invention meant for humanity's scattered resistance. Every isolated cell could now coordinate with every other cell. Every human settlement across the galaxy could share information and plan joint operations. The hegemony had conquered humanity by dividing them and cutting off communication between different groups, but quantum entanglement made those tactics useless. Admiral Kethvar studied the reports from across human space with growing confusion and frustration. His forces had captured mining stations and farming colonies, but the humans operating those facilities had destroyed everything useful before retreating to positions that seemed impossible to assault. Meanwhile, attacks on hegemony supply lines were increasing in coordination and effectiveness, suggesting that the scattered human cells were somehow sharing intelligence. Human resistance is exhibiting unprecedented coordination despite the absence of any detectable communication network, reported his intelligence officer, a member of the telepathic Caltharian species who specialized in analyzing enemy behavior patterns. "Their attack patterns suggest they are receiving real-time information about our troop movements and supply schedules." Kethvar's tactical displays showed the scope of the problem across his entire command area. Human colonies that should have surrendered were instead turning themselves into fortresses, using civilian infrastructure as weapons and disappearing into terrain they knew better than any orbital survey could map. Meanwhile, human ships appeared throughout his territory carrying supplies to resistance cells, somehow avoiding detection by the most advanced sensor networks in the galaxy. "Deploy additional patrol squadrons to all human-occupied systems," Kethvar ordered. "Institute random search patterns and mandatory inspections of all civilian traffic. Begin systematic mapping of all human settlements using ground-based reconnaissance." The new orders resulted in immediate contact between hegemony forces and human resistance cells across a dozen star systems. But instead of quick victories against isolated enemies, the aliens found themselves facing coordinated defenders who seemed to know exactly when and where attacks would come. Mining lasers and farming equipment and civilian ships all became weapons in human hands, turned against their alien attackers with an ingenuity that no military manual had prepared the hegemony to face. On New Montana, Maya's fighters opened the main irrigation valves and flooded the valley where hegemony forces had established their command post, turning fertile farmland into an impassable swamp. At Omega 7, Ryan used the station's ore processing equipment to launch chunks of metallic asteroid material at alien ships, turning his mining operation into a massive railgun. Nick Carter's freighter delivered quantum communicators to isolated human communities, connecting them to the growing network of resistance cells that Dr. Chang had made possible. But the most important thing the quantum communication network delivered was something that no military strategist had anticipated: hope. For the first time since the invasion began, humans across the galaxy could hear each other's voices and know that they were not alone in their fight. Resistance cells that had been fighting desperately against impossible odds learned that hundreds of other human communities were fighting the same battle and refusing to surrender. "We're not just surviving anymore," Jake Morrison told his team as they listened to reports from resistance cells across the galaxy. "We're becoming something the hegemony never expected to face, a species that fights harder when you try to break us apart." The quantum network carried more than tactical information and supply requests. It carried stories of human determination and ingenuity that inspired others to keep fighting. Tales of farmers who turned irrigation systems into weapons, miners who converted industrial equipment into fortress defenses, and smugglers who risked everything to keep isolated communities connected to the wider human family. Each story proved that surrender was not inevitable, that humans could find ways to resist even when victory seemed impossible. As the second phase of humanity's resistance began, the hegemony faced a problem they had never encountered in centuries: of conquest, an enemy that grew stronger when divided, more determined when threatened, and more creative when desperate. The aliens had expected to face a conventional military force that could be defeated through superior firepower, but instead, they found themselves fighting an entire species that refused to accept the concept of defeat. The morning sky over Denver burned orange with smoke and alien fire as Captain Jake Morrison crawled through the ruins of what used to be his city. 3 months had passed since the hegemony arrived and declared Earth under their control. 3 months since every government on the planet had been given one simple choice: surrender or die. Most alien species across the galaxy had chosen surrender when faced with the hegemony's overwhelming power, but humans were different. Humans chose a third option that no one expected. Jake pressed his back against a broken concrete wall and checked his rifle. The weapon was a mix of human engineering and stolen alien technology, jury-rigged together in the underground workshops that had become humanity's last factories. Behind him, 5 other resistance fighters waited for his signal, their faces dirty and tired, but their eyes still burning with determination that confused their alien enemies. "Movement ahead," whispered Zara Hassan, the young woman who handled communications for their cell. Her equipment was spread across her back like electronic wings, antennas and receivers that she had built from scrapped alien devices and old, human electronics. She could hack into hegemony communications better than anyone else in the Denver underground, and right now she was their eyes in a world where satellites no longer belonged to humanity. Jake nodded and moved forward, his team following like shadows through the rubble. They had learned to move like ghosts in their own cities, using tunnels and sewers and hidden paths that the aliens had not yet discovered. The hegemony controlled the sky and the main streets, but they had never learned to fight an enemy that refused to stand still and be conquered. 6 blocks away, in a bunker buried beneath the ruins of the University of Colorado, Dr. Lisa Chang worked by the light of emergency lamps on equations that might save the human race. She had been one of the world's leading quantum physicists before the invasion, and now she was possibly the last scientist on Earth still working on theoretical research. The other survivors thought she was wasting time with her calculations, when she should be building weapons, but Lisa knew that humanity's real weapon was not going to be guns or bombs. "The quantum entanglement field is stable," she muttered to herself, adjusting the makeshift equipment that filled her laboratory. The device she was building looked like junk to anyone else, a collection of mirrors and crystals and alien components that she had stolen from crashed hegemony ships. But Lisa saw something different. She saw a way to connect every human resistance cell across the galaxy, a way to turn humanity's scattered survivors into a single coordinated force. Above ground, Commander Alex Rodriguez coordinated the day's operations from a mobile command post hidden in an abandoned subway tunnel. He had been a general before the invasion, responsible for defending North America's western coast, and now he commanded what remained of Earth's military forces. His army was made up of soldiers and civilians, adults and teenagers, anyone who could hold a weapon and refuse to kneel before alien masters. "Report from Seattle Cell," said his communications officer, a former Marine named Pete Wilson who had lost his left arm in the first week of fighting. "They hit another hegemony supply convoy last night, captured enough power cells to keep their sector running for 2 weeks. Alex smiled grimly as he marked the success on his map. The map showed a world under alien occupation, but it also showed hundreds of red dots marking active resistance cells. Every dot represented humans who had chosen to fight rather than submit. Humans who proved every day that conquest and surrender were not the same thing. High above Earth's atmosphere, Admiral Kethvar of the Hegemony 4th Fleet stared down at the blue and green planet that should have been pacified months ago. His flagship hung in orbit like a metal moon, surrounded by hundreds of smaller vessels that represented the might of 12 different alien species united under hegemony rule. Every other world had fallen to this fleet within days or weeks, but Earth continued to burn with resistance. "Status report," Kethvar commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had conquered 17 star systems. "Human military resistance remains active in 47% of major population centers," replied his tactical officer, a member of the insectoid Zephyrians who served as the hegemony's analysts. Civilian cooperation with occupation forces remains at less than 12%, the lowest compliance rate in hegemony history. Kethavar's three eyes narrowed as he processed this information. In his experience, species that refused initial surrender terms could be broken through demonstration of superior force, but humans seemed to grow more determined with each defeat. They had no unified command structure left to target, no government to negotiate with, no central authority that could order surrender. Instead, they fought as individuals and small groups, each cell acting independently but somehow still coordinating their attacks. Deploy the Psychological Warfare Division, Kethavar ordered. Begin broadcasts explaining the benefits of hegemony, membership, offer food and medical care to those who surrender, show them recordings of other species who have prospered under our guidance. The broadcasts began that afternoon, transmitted on every frequency and in every human language. The messages spoke of peace and prosperity, of technological advancement and an end to war, of humanity's place in a galactic civilization that spanned thousands of worlds. Similar broadcasts had convinced dozens of other species to abandon resistance and accept hegemony rule. Jake and his team listened to the broadcasts from their hiding place in an old shopping mall, and when the alien voices finished speaking, they looked at each other and began to laugh. The laughter spread through the resistance network as humans across the planet heard the same promises that had been used to pacify other species. Promises that assumed humans wanted safety more than freedom. They still don't understand, Jake said as he checked his equipment for the night's mission. They think we're fighting because we're afraid or because we don't understand what they're offering. What are we fighting for then? Asked one of his younger fighters, a teenager named Bobby Clark who had joined the resistance after his family was killed in the first bombardment. Jake looked out through a crack in the mall's broken windows at the alien ships patrolling overhead, their lights sweeping the ruins like the eyes of hunting predators. We're fighting because some things are worth more than staying alive, he said. We're fighting because freedom isn't something you can take away from someone who refuses to give it up. That night, as Jake's team prepared for another raid against impossible odds, similar scenes played out in resistance cells around the world. Humans who had every reason to surrender instead checked their weapons and made their plans, preparing to prove once again that conquest required more than superior firepower. It required breaking the spirit of the conquered, and the human spirit had proven remarkably difficult to break.